Hi, welcome back to Fastball Profits. This is our daily fantasy video for week 8. Now, we're going to pretty much get right into the players, but before we do, we want to let you know at the end of this video, we're going to do a recap of how we did last week. Some of the players that we talked about, were we successful, did we fail, how much money we made, not made, etc. The one thing that we want to say before we get into the video is thank you for all you guys who have supported us through the years, who liked and subscribed, continue to support us. Here's what we want you to do. Like, comment, share our videos, and then as the resources continue to come in, we're just going to reinvest it back into the site. We're looking at video, audio, visual, things like that, just getting you better information so that you can be successful. But let's get right into our quarterback slide.
Well, as well, make sure to stick around for the end of the video because then we're going to talk about and show you guys our daily fantasy lineup for this week and just a few reasons kind of why we put together the lineup that we did. So that should be fun. So make sure to stick around for that.
All right. So before you get into your quarterbacks, a couple of things. You know, daily fantasy, it's easy to say Todd Gurley is going to be successful. Anybody can say that. The real challenge is about finding value plays to create cap space so that you can afford the good plays. That's what it's all about. So how do you begin to do that? Like I said, anybody can say start Alvin Kamara, start Todd Gurley, but the real, I think, success is in how you find those value plays. And then the other thing we want to qualify is by saying, there's a lot of daily fantasy sites out there. You got DraftKings, Yahoo, Fanball, FanDuel. So instead of trying to say it's going to cost you $25 or $5,200 or whatever it is cap space wise, because every site is different, what we've done is we've given averages consistent with multiple sites, and we're going to give you percentage of cost of your cap. And that's how we're going to do this. So no matter what site you use, it's going to be applicable for you. But Christian, why don't you get into your quarterbacks?
All right, so first quarterback I want to talk about is Jameis Winston. Now he's going to cost you about 15.5% of your salary. That's actually pretty good. I noticed that a lot of daily fantasy sites force us to pay more for quarterbacks than we want to. For whatever reason, a lot of sites tend to put a lot of value on that, so that's one thing to remember. For starters, we like Jameis Winston. He's a really good fantasy quarterback. Whether or not you like him as a good quarterback, you have to admit that this guy can absolutely go off some weeks. He plays Cincinnati, who gives up the 5th most points to quarterbacks this season, and over the last 2 games, he's thrown for over 760 yards. Again, his 4-to-4 touchdown interception ratio isn't great, but this has nothing to do with whether or not he's a good quarterback. He's a good fantasy quarterback. He's got 2 good tight ends. He's got a couple of good wideouts. The running game is a mess. The defense is a mess, and he's got a good matchup. So I really like Winston this week. He's fairly cheap. If you want to go slightly more expensive for about 16.5% of your salary is Kirk Cousins. He plays the New Orleans Saints, who give up the 2nd most fantasy points to quarterbacks. And Kirk Cousins, he's playing well. Of course, a lot of people believe this, and I don't want to say it's true. I don't want to agree with it just because I'm a Vikings fan, but a lot of people are saying that Diggs and Thielen might be the best 2-receiver combo in the NFL right now. I mean, the hype is huge on them. Rudolph isn't a bad tight end. He's completing 70% of his passes. He looks great. And then you go play the Saints, who have a bad defense and a really good offense. They're going to force the Vikings to put up some points. So this could be a big week for Kirk Cousins. So I absolutely like that matchup. And then the final quarterback that I want to talk about is Baker Mayfield. Now he's a little bit cheaper. If you didn't quite want to pay as much for either of those guys, you can go Baker Mayfield for 13% of your salary. He's been playing just average. He hasn't been amazing, but he plays Pittsburgh, who gives up the 4th most points to quarterbacks and are absolutely going to force the Browns to put up some points if they want to win. The Steelers, of course, have an awesome receiving core, a couple of good tight ends. Running back James Conner has been on fire lately. We'll talk a little bit more about him later. So I like Baker Mayfield for a little bit cheaper for sure.
All right, so my guys, well, first of all, we didn't compare. He does his research, I do mine, we come together, so we're not, I didn't look at your numbers. I've got the exact same 3 guys. For me, I got Baker Mayfield, 13% of your cap space, like you had said, playing Pittsburgh, giving up the 4th most points to quarterbacks. Big Ben's going to score points, especially at home. He's a lot more successful at home than he is on the road there. They're going to need to play catch up. And his last game that he played was his best fantasy game of the year, so I think Baker Mayfield is a good play there. I feel comfortable if you need to start him. I also like Jameis Winston, like you said, same thing, 15 to 16% of your cap space. I think for me, I'm surprised he's still so cheap out there. Why they haven't adjusted his value higher? I think they probably will in the next few weeks. This might be the very last week where I would still consider him a cheaper play at this point. Playing Cincinnati, give him the 5th most points to quarterbacks. This is what I would call the perfect storm of making a great fantasy quarterback, which is, one, that defense for Tampa Bay is terrible. In fact, not only is that defense bad, it got worse if that's possible. They lost Quan Alexander for the year on the IR, and they fired the defensive coordinator. And so if it's possible, that defense might actually get worse. So they got a bad defense, and they've got great weapons, and he's actually a very talented quarterback. And so he's a perfect example of a bad storm there. In many scoring systems, The last 2 weeks he's over 30 points scoring. So in fact, I looked at it. 1 week he led all quarterbacks in scoring. The other week he was third in fantasy scoring. So he's a legitimately really good quarterback to have in fantasy. And I like Kirk Cousins. You said it right. The Saints are giving the second most points to quarterbacks. They're so bad on defense. They traded for cornerback Apple this week. They know they need to fix some things there. They need help. He's averaged over 300 passing yards per game on the year. He's got a 14 touchdown passes, only 3 interceptions. He's got great weapons. I love, like you said, Diggs and Thielen. I would probably say I like Juju Smith-Schuster and Brown probably a little bit more. But man, they're both great. So how could either receiving core is awesome there. So I'm not going to get too much into that. But if you want to go some really cheap quarterback options, these are some cheap options, but they carry higher risk. Now, typically when I do daily fantasy, I take calculated risk. You've got to be willing to save money somewhere, but I like to lock up cheap guys that I still feel confident in production. But here's some guys that are cheaper, but there are some risk. And one is Joe Flacco, 13% of your cap space. Now he's playing Carolina, and Joe Flacco's been hit or miss. He's had some games he's been really good, and other games he's been really quiet. The one concern I have for the Ravens is that the way they want to win games is playing defense. That's kind of their MO there. Another guy, now this one's really, really risky. Personally, I wouldn't take it, but if you're a gambler, if you a guy likes to roll the dice, Josh Rosen, 10 to 11% of your cap space. He's very cheap. He's playing San Francisco, who allows the 7th most points to quarterbacks there. Personally, I wouldn't trust him, but if you're cap strapped, if you really feel like you've got to play some of those big name running backs or wide receivers, you could roll the dice with him. And then the final guy is Case Keenum. He's going to be about 15% of your cap space. He's playing the Rams. I don't trust him as much as the options that you had talked about. But they're going to need to throw a lot in that game, playing catch up. That Rams offense is almost unstoppable. So I think they're going to have to throw a lot. I wouldn't be surprised if he throws the ball 40 to 45 times in this game, just trying to keep up with them. And so those are some quarterbacks you should consider in daily fantasy. You want to get to running backs?
Yeah, let's get to the running backs for sure. All right, so we'll start off here with probably one of the more obvious ones. I think you got to go with James Conner. He's going to cost you only 15% of your salary, which is very cheap for a guy who has had over 200 yards and 4 touchdowns in the last 2 games. I mean, he's been on fire. Not only that, but he plays against the Cleveland Browns this week, who give up the 10th most fantasy points to running backs. And again, 15% of your salary, that's extremely cheap for a running back who is really been on fire lately, who's dominating. I don't see necessarily any reasons or signs popping up that that's going to slow down because he has a good matchup and because Le'Veon Bell is not back. The Steelers really rely on him, not only to get the ball moving on the ground. He does catch the ball a little bit, but not a whole lot, but not quite as well as not quite as much as Le'Veon Bell, but because of that, they've been running the ball with him quite a bit, and so I like that matchup a lot. You look like you had something to say, and I can't seem to speak right now. So do you want to?
No. I mean, well, I'm going to say the same thing when it comes to me. I'm talking about James Conner, 15% of your salary cap versus Cleveland. 3 times this year, he's had over 100 yards rushing. He's had 7 TDs on the year and 26 catches. So he's doing really well in the passing game. Like you said, not as good as Bell, but then who is? Bell is an elite in the history of the NFL. There's not too many backs better than him in the passing game. Going back to James Conner, he is a top 10 RB1. I'm really hoping. I got James Conner in a few leagues. I'm hoping and praying that Bell decides he just wants to sit out the whole year. So.
Yeah, exactly. All right, so hopefully I can get back on track here. The next guy I want to mention is Kerryon Johnson. Man, we have been extremely, extremely impressed with Kerryon Johnson this year. I feel confident speaking for both of us. It's going to cost you, I believe in Yahoo's 21. That makes him about 11.5%, 10.5% of your salary. So that's extremely cheap. And his production has been there. There's really 2 concerns for him this week, but his production is there. So first, the good. He's averaging 6.4 yards per carry, and he's catching the ball in the backfield 3 times last game. He's had 2 100-yard rushing games, and both were under 20 carries. Like, he is effective when he's getting the ball. To rush for over 100 yards with under 20 carries in that game, that's very impressive. So we're excited about him. He looks awesome as far as keeper league go. Like, I'm in all my keeper leagues, dynasty leagues, like, I want to trade for him. I want to get for him. I want to have him next year. But we're focused on this week, and I think the 2 concerns are, one is he has struggled to find the end zone. That's not something that he's really done this season. And then on top of that, he plays Seattle's defense, who is been a little bit impressive this year. I think a lot of people expected them to completely fall apart, and they haven't been great, but they have been middle of the road, a little bit above average against the run, and so those are 2 concerns. However, he really seems to be cementing himself as the solid running back in that option, as LeGarrette Blount has proven himself to be very, very ineffective. So I like Kerryon Johnson a lot. Another guy that I have to mention is Marlon Mack. Now, he is currently questionable And so it looks like he might not play, but if he does end up playing, it's so hard for me not to put this guy in a daily fantasy lineup. He has been so hot lately.
Yeah, and before you get to your breakdown, the rest of Marlon Mack, he did miss 2 practices. He looked very questionable. He's a guy that's battled injuries his whole career, which is not very long, I guess, a couple years, but he's had a history of injuries. But he did practice in full today, and so as of today, later on today, reports came in that it looks like he's on track to play now. So Wednesday, Thursday didn't look good. As of this afternoon on Friday, looks like he might play.
Absolutely. That's huge news. On top of that, he's been performing well, 215 rushing yards on 6.9 yards per carry and 2 touchdowns over the last 2 weeks. Marlon Mack, when he plays, one thing I forgot to mention, he's only going to cost you 10% of your salary, by the way. One of the cheapest running backs that you can go out there and find is Marlon Mack. And again, over the last 2 games, he's averaging over 100 yards and getting a touchdown each game, solid 6.9 yards per carry. When he plays with Andrew Luck, their production together is so crazy. Andrew Luck has been on fire, and that passing game really has been opening up a lot for Marlon Mack to be able to do. He's getting involved in the receiving game a little bit, and he's just been super effective. I mean, it's hard to argue with those numbers, that's for sure. And then, of course, on the flip side, I do have to mention Nyheim Hines, the backup to Marlon Mack. If Marlon Mack doesn't play, Hines is a very risky play, but might be one worth taking because I don't think a lot of people are going to put them in their lineups. He's cheap. He's only going to cost you 7% of your salary, and he's on pace for 73 receptions, 411 receiving yards, and 7 combined touchdowns this year. That's what he's on pace for. And so, yeah, again, I like that. This is 100%. This is only based on Marlon Mack's health and if he plays. If Mack does not play, Hines is a risky but high upside play. If Mack plays, don't play Hines in your lineup. And then, of course, the last guy that I want to talk about is Tariq Cohen. He's going to cost you about 8.5% of your salary. Over the last 3 games, he's been extremely productive. Gone out and had 24 carries for 98 yards. That's not great. That's not what he does, though. He's had 22 catches for 280 yards and 3 total touchdowns. And, of course, we've talked about this in a lot of our other recent videos, which I'm sure many of you have seen. Jordan Howard's simply not getting the job done, and Tariq Cohen's been really gaining a lot of momentum in that offense, getting more reps, touching the ball more, and so I think that bodes really well for him. And then I believe this week they go and they play the Jets, if I'm not mistaken. And so I think that could be a good week where the Bears aren't going to have to score a ton of points. The Bears have a good defense versus a rookie quarterback. Could be a low-scoring affair, and I wouldn't be surprised if Cohen got the ball quite a bit. So I like him as well. Again, all fairly cheap options there. I don't want to sit here and tell you, well, obviously you should play Todd Gurley this week, or obviously you should play, David Johnson or all these stars that everybody knows about. And so those are just a couple of options. But Rob, who do you have? What do you want to add?
Well, to add something to what you said there, you talked about Nyheim Hines, the guy that you start if Marlon Mack is out, and that's a great play. If Mack turns out, then you need to plug this guy in. What I would say about Hines' stats, his numbers are actually better. Some of those numbers were hurt because last game Mack was in there and the game before Mack was in there, so that kind of decreased Hines' value. If you look at the numbers that he's had when Mack has been out, and then you project that out, they're actually considerably better. So you have to take that into account. Now, before I get into my running backs, one of the things that we say in fantasy football, you need to stay flexible. Information always changes. What you hear on a Wednesday may change by Friday or Saturday, and that's really true of daily fantasy. All it takes is one starting running back to be out, his backup is starting, and before you know it, you can get another running back for quite a bit cheaper, and then you can use that money to reinvest. So staying flexible is so important. So we encourage you to stay flexible, always follow new information, and then reinvest. Daily fantasy, that's vitally important that you reinvest that money. So guys, I want to talk about, I'm not going to be labored. I love Kerryon Johnson also for 10 to 11% of your salary cap, 6.4 yards per carry. This guy can run well. He's got good hands. He's explosive, legitimately a good running back. Another guy I like is Phillip Lindsay. He's going to cost you about 13% of your cap space. And he's playing Kansas City, who gives up the 3rd most points to running backs. Now, right now, Rice Freeman's banged up, and it looks like he might sit out the game, which means that Lindsay is going to have an increased role in this one. And each week, he's actually been playing better than Freeman and really distanced himself as far as who he is as a running back there. They use him a lot in passing packages. He's had great hands coming out of college, so even if they're playing from behind, Lindsay's still going to get a lot of value and a lot of touches in this game there. I love this guy. The other one is Joe Mixon. Joe Mixon is going to cost you about 14 to 15% of your cap space. Playing Tampa Bay, the worst defense in the NFL, who, like I said, lost their defensive coordinator. Quan Alexander is now out for the year. He's on the IR, and so I like Joe Mixon there. Another guy that I like, and we'll get to him at the very end, is James White. He's going to be about 10 to 11% of your cap space. Now, most daily fantasy sites use PPR scoring. Now he's playing the Bills this week, but Sony Michel is likely out. He's missed practice 3 days this week. We didn't really expect he's going to play. And he's got 7 TDs on the year and 45 catches. He's on pace for 103 catches for the year. I love James White, especially in PPR leagues. Another one I like out there is Raheem Mostert, the running back for the San Francisco 49ers. He's going to cost you about 6 to 7% of your cap space. He's really cheap. He's playing Arizona. That gives up the most points to running backs. Now, this, of course, is contingent on Matt Breida being out. If Breida's out, I like this guy. If Breida ends up playing, then, of course, I'm probably not going to use him there. Last 2 games, he's got 7.68 yards per carry, and he's a great fit for Shanahan's offense. Really like him. Another guy out there, a little bit risky, but Isaiah Crowell. 8% of your cap space. Now, Powell's out for the year, so he's going to become the clear guy in touches there. Isaiah Crowell is going to be dependent on that offense to get the ball a lot. Now, he's playing a Bears defense that's tougher, but he has found the end zone, and he's had some good games there. So he's a guy that's a high-risk, high-reward play. And Tariq Cohen, I'm not going to say a whole lot about him. I love this guy, 8 to 9% of your cap space versus the Jets. You said 3 TDs in a row, 22 catches during those 3 games, 28 yards. I mean, this guy's really on fire. He really is a great fit for Nagy's offense there, so I like him. Then Latavius Murray, about 9% of your cap space. So Cook is going to be out again. He's had 2 really good games in a row after struggling early in the year. Now, the one thing I would say about Latavius Murray there is the Saints aren't a good offense. They're not a good defense. They struggle quite a bit on defense, but they're actually decent against the run. And so Latavius Murray would look like a good play, but he's not a great play in that one. Now, if you're a gambling guy out there, if you're a guy who likes to roll the dice and gamble quite a bit, here's some really, really cheap options, but they carry higher risk. One is Ronald Jones. If Barber is out, looks like Barber's probably going to play, but if he happens to be out, you could go with Ronald Jones. Then the other one is Doug Martin. Doug Martin's going to be about 6% of your cap space. Of course, Marshawn Lynch is out for the year. Coach came out and said he's going to get a lot of those carries. They're playing in Indianapolis, but honestly, I'm just not a huge fan of Doug Martin. I really need a prove-it game from him before I can trust him. So.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. I guess on the bright side with those players, if you put them in your lineup, a lot of other people aren't. So maybe that could be huge. But yeah, those are some risky plays. I'd have a hard time throwing them in my lineup for sure.
I would probably stay away from the last 2 guys I mentioned.
All right, so now let's just talk about a couple of wideouts we'll go through. I've got a few, and then I'll let Rob go. Try not to take too long on these. But Robert Woods, he's going to cost you about 13.5% of your salary, and this is a particularly good play this week because of Cooper Kupp. As you mentioned to me recently, I saw that he was questionable, but he has now been shifted to doubtful. Is that correct?
Yes.
So that makes a big deal now. That being the case, the Rams being undefeated so far, they don't desperately need a win, and he's probably their best wideout. They're going to sit him. That just makes sense. They're not going to risk re-injuring him or putting him out for the rest of the season. And so Cooper Kupp being out is huge. Robert Woods is going to be the premier receiver this week. Of course, they have Brandon Cooks, but he's really a deep threat sort of guy. He is a good wideout, but who is the reliable receiver in short to mid-range, right? Who is the end zone or who's the red zone target lot? That's Robert Woods. And he's been very productive. He's averaging 96 yards and 0.5 touchdowns over the Rams' last 5 games. Now, on top of that, he's going to get more targets and more share. He could easily have over 100 yards and a touchdown this week. I wouldn't be surprised. On top of that, the Rams play the Packers, who've given up 11 receiving touchdowns to just wideouts this season. And so they're not doing very good as far as keeping wideouts out of the end zone. I very much like Robert Woods for a very cheap price tag. Another wideout that I like, possibly the best wideout I like this week, is Emmanuel Sanders. He'll cost you about 12.5% of your salary, and he's been extremely productive. So he's had 3 games this season where he's had over 100 yards and a touchdown. That's very good. If your wideout gets you 100 yards and a touchdown, he had a very good week, and so you can feel confident about that. Not only has he done that 3 times this season, he's done it 2 weeks in a row now, and I wouldn't be surprised if you came out and did it a 3rd week in a row because they play Kansas City, probably the one team that can go up against Denver's defense and put up points and force that Broncos offense to score. On top of that, he's got a very gunslingerish quarterback in Case Keenum, so I love that. And then, of course, he's really emerged over Demaryius Thomas as the #1 receiver in that offense. His targets have gone up, his yards have gone up. He seems to be the guy. He's got a lot of chemistry with his quarterback. And so, yeah, I like Sanders this week. It's a great matchup where I really think that the Chiefs are going to force them to score. Moving on now, Jarvis Landry. Now, he's going to cost you 9.5% of your salary in most daily fantasy. And he's very PPR. He's a very big PPR stud. His target and reception dependent, if you're in a daily fantasy PPR, this is huge. This is in a standard, he's a pretty good start. In a PPR, he's a must start. Again, he's going to cost you, 9.5% of your salary. And he's had at least 10 targets in all but 1 games this season. They played Pittsburgh, who gives up the 4th most points to wide receivers. And quarterback Baker Mayfield really relies upon him, just simply because there aren't a whole lot of talented wide receivers there. They had a lot of guys at the beginning of this year. Josh Gordon left, and they got rid of Corey Coleman, and
Callaway has struggled. There's been injuries to Higgins. I mean, after him, it's probably David Njoku who's their best receiver.
After that, it goes to the tight end. And Njoku, don't get us wrong, is a good tight end. But because of those lack of wideouts, Jarvis Landry is going to be relied upon a lot. So yeah, the targets are there, the matchup is there, and the need is there. So I like Landry this week a lot, especially in PPR leagues. We'll go now to Doug Baldwin. A lot of people are iffy and kind of scared on Doug Baldwin, but you shouldn't be. He's only going to cost you 9.5% of your salary, and he finally turned it on a little bit last game. So he had 8 targets for 6 catches and 91 yards. That's good, not great, because he didn't find the end zone. But he's finally coming off of a bye week, so he's finally getting healthy. He plays last game, and he plays well, and then he has a bye week. Now he's fully healthy, which has been the thing that's held Baldwin back all season. You have to remember this quarterback is Russell Wilson, and he is Russell Wilson's #1 target. When he plays, Doug Baldwin is the man in that offense. I mean, who is he competing for targets with? Tyler Lockett? Like, really, he's the guy, and so I love Doug Baldwin this week, who could really, I think he could explode this week for sure in a game against the Lions, who don't have a fantastic defense. And then finally, kind of digging a little bit deep here, here's a really high risk, high reward one, and that's Traquan Smith. He'll cost you 7% of your salary in most daily fantasy leagues. Last week was an impressive week. They played the Baltimore Ravens, and he had 44 yards last week, 6 targets, 3 catches, 44 yards, didn't find the end zone. It wasn't amazing, but he's really only been in that lineup solid for 2 weeks now. And in those 2 weeks, he had that game, but the week before, he had 111 yards and 2 touchdowns. He looked amazing. And I don't think you should be scared by his performance against the Ravens. We were talking, and I don't know if you agree with this. I certainly think this is the case. Right now, Baltimore Ravens seem to have the best defense in the NFL. They're shutting teams down left and right. And although they're going to go up against the Vikings, who are a good defense this week, Xavier Rhodes is struggling with injury and might not play. He did practice today, but I heard something that he wasn't necessarily doing all drills, or he didn't practice the whole day, or whatever it was. I don't know exactly what the details were. And so if he doesn't play, or if he plays banged up, that's a huge knock on that defense. Him and Harrison Smith seem to be the anchors of that defense, and so that's something to keep in mind. Smith could have an explosive week. I mean, he didn't play well against the Ravens, but you go to a little bit worse defense, a bit banged up defense, and against an offense that can put up some points. So that's a risk I think that might be worth taking if you're looking to save some money at wideout. But I'll quit talking. Rob, who are the wideouts you want to talk about?
So deals out there, obviously, it's I can tell you to start Antonio Brown, but I don't want to beat a dead horse. Everybody knows that. The guy that I like out there that's cheap is Christian Kirk. About 7% of your cap space, playing San Francisco. He's a very young, talented wide receiver. He's quick. He's got good hands. He's drawn a lot of comparisons to Odell Beckham, which is a great person to be compared to, at least as far as your on-the-field play. So anyways, he's been drawing 18.7% of the target share on his team there. But in the NFL, right now, he's currently the 7th wide receiver in catch rate at 74.7%. And in the NFL, he's the number 26 wide receiver in yards per target at 9.9. That's fairly impressive. I think he's been hindered by the play of Rosen and the offensive line. They got a new offensive coordinator there. I think things are going to get better. I think he's very talented. I think he could be a nice steal. I also like Demaryius Thomas, about 9% of your cap space. They're playing Kansas City. That Kansas City offense has been fun to watch. They're going to put points on the board, I'm assuming. Even though that Denver defense has been improving, I think that Kansas City is going to be just fine there. They're going to need to throw the ball a lot. He's what I would call a good volume play. He's had touchdowns 2 of the last 3 games. And then like you, Jarvis Landry, I'm not going to say that. He's a guy that I've got locked into almost all my daily fantasy lineups there. He's another one that's a great play. Playing Pittsburgh, who gives up the 5th most points to wide receivers. And then I also like going back to the Demaryius Thomas argument is Emmanuel Sanders. I agree with you, 12 to 13% of your cap space. Playing Kansas City, they're going to have to throw a lot, and he's been their most productive wide receiver, hands down, in that offense. You mentioned Robert Woods. I would agree. I also have him down on my list here. Cooper Kupp's going to be out there. That offense is unstoppable. I think that he's going to be just fine. I think he's going to have a good game. 100 yards TD is easy, wealth, and reach. I like Mike Evans. Mike Evans about 13 to 14% of your salary cap. Now, he's a guy that I won't consider cheap, But he's one of those guys that's right in that bubble, that tier one. He's almost as good as Hopkins and Brown, but he's not going to cost you nearly the same amount of money playing Cincinnati. This year he's got 3 touchdowns and 3 times over 100 yards in a game, and it should be a higher scoring game there. I like him. Another one that people are kind of skittish on, but I like, is T.Y. Hilton. About 14% of your cap space playing Oakland. He's Luck's favorite target. If you look back, when they've both been on the field together and healthy, this is a guy that's got wide receiver 1 type talent. He's very, very good. Last week we said to start him. I know a lot of you didn't want to. We hope you did. He had 2 touchdowns. And then the final guy I want to talk about there is Josh Gordon. About 9% of your cap space. Now, he missed some practice this week, but it sounds to me like it's precautionary. He's fine. It's the same pattern of practice that he's had for weeks since he's been there. Brady's loving this guy. They're going to get him more and more involved in that offense with Gronkowski banged up and question marks at running back. I think that his values are going to continue to go up. I like Josh Gordon. So those are my wide receivers.
Absolutely. I completely agree with the T.Y. Hilton thing. In fact, Andrew Luck has been on fire. The last 4 weeks, he threw 4 touchdowns, 3 touchdowns, 4 touchdowns, and 4 touchdowns. That's absolutely insane. And you know what? You look at that wide receiving core, there's not a lot of talent there outside of T.Y. Hilton. You talk about they've got, a few different guys
Chester
there.
Rogers, who's kind of a volume play, some other guys there, they're just not great.
Then none of them have really, I think a lot of people barely know their names. None of them have separated themselves. T.Y. Hilton's the guy. I'm not a big fan as far as from a football and coaching perspective of wideouts who are deep ball wideouts, big play wideouts, and that's what T.Y. Hilton does. But he gets the job done. I think he's a great option this week, and he has such a high ceiling. At any point in any season, he can go off for 220 yards, 2 touchdowns, and so that's probably one of my favorite picks. I like that.
Okay, let's get to our tight ends.
All right, so I want to talk about 3 tight ends, and the first is fairly obvious. David Njoku. He's going to cost you 8% of your salary, and it's pretty simple. He's been productive. He's scored a touchdown in back-to-back weeks, and he plays Pittsburgh, who gives up the 3rd most fantasy points to tight ends. That's not very exciting, but it's a very smart pick right there. You're not saving a ton of money at this position, but you're not spending a lot either. I think for Travis Kelce, you're going to have to pay, a little bit more than that. Instead of 8%, it's maybe 12 or 13%. So you are saving, but not a ton. So it's kind of in the middle. And then again, we talked about, this comes back to Jarvis Landry. The quarterback play of Baker Mayfield has gotten better every week. That's simply, he's a rookie quarterback who is improving, and that's huge, right? If a guy's 5 years in the NFL and he has a good week last week, oh, well, he had a good week. But when a rookie has a good week last week, that's probably a good sign that he's developing and he's getting better. On top of that, he has shown that he wants to throw to Njoku, and there aren't a whole lot of other options. It's him and Landry, and so a very safe and solid pick is David Njoku. Another pick that people have been huge on, and we're maybe a little bit less huge on, but we still like, is CJ Uzomah. I hope I'm saying that right. Now, somebody left a comment because I talked about him in a recent video and said, you know what, he's a desperation play and you don't like him that much or whatever, and they were upset. It's not that I don't like him. I did want to make sure we didn't overhype him. He is a risky play, but he might be worth it. He's going to cost you 7% of your salary. He plays Tampa Bay, who gives up the most fantasy points to tight ends. He pulled in a touchdown last week, but the reason that you need to know that he is a very risky play is that besides one good game this season, he's averaging only 1.8 receptions a game and 21.6 yards. He is not a great option, but if you want to take a gamble and save some money, CJ is probably a good option. They're playing for Cincinnati. And then finally, going to cost you 6.5% of your salary. This is maybe one of my favorite of the tight ends to go with this week is Benjamin Watson. He scored last week, which is always a good sign, and he plays the Vikings, who give up the 7th most fantasy points to tight ends and have allowed over 500 yards to tight ends in the last 7 games. Tight ends are producing on the Vikings, against the Vikings, every single week. That's a good defense, and I like the way that they could match up with a lot of their secondary against wide receivers and even the run game. But if for some reason they're just not able to do it against tight ends. So again, if you want to save some money, I like Benjamin Watson this week against the Vikings. Of course, he's got a great quarterback in Drew Brees, and so it's pretty simple, but I like it.
All right. So for me, for tight ends, I had similar ones to you, but I want to talk about Chris Herndon, tight end for the Jets. He's going to be as cheap as it gets, only 5% of your cap space. Now, he's playing Chicago in Chicago. That's not a good matchup, but he's the bottom of the barrel cost with some upside. He's as cheap as you're going to get out there. He's a guy that has some risk to it, but he has some reward. He's not a lock to be very productive. Yet the last 2 weeks he's had a touchdown there, and so he's definitely a guy that you could get for very cheap. Another guy out there is Michael Roberts. If you're a risk taker, if you're a gambler, I'm not. I won't trust this guy. But he's got 3 touchdowns on the year. Makes me think he hasn't had a lot of catches. I think he's got 4 catches and 3 been for touchdowns. Makes me think back to Buddy Ryan, who said Chris Carter all he does is catch touchdowns. So, but he's another one that's gonna be the bottom of the barrel, as cheap as it gets if you want to roll the dice. Some guys that I'm more comfortable with, more kind of where I'm at as far as what I call calculated risks, is Benjamin Watson, 6 to 7% of your cap space. Playing Minnesota, good defense, but they allow a lot of points to tight ends. Like I said, the Minnesota D is very good, but they are vulnerable to tight ends. And then CJ, same thing, playing Tampa Bay, most points to tight ends. I agree with you in your assessment. I think it's a great matchup, but don't assume he's going to have a huge game. He's a guy that hasn't been great. And even when Tyler Eifert was there, the one thing that Tyler Eifert was known for was catching touchdowns. He didn't get a lot of catches. He didn't get a lot of receptions. So I think that he's a guy that you can roll the dice with there, but I wouldn't consider him a great play. David Njoku, yeah, Pittsburgh gives up the 3rd most points to tight ends, another good play. And then Trey Burton. Trey Burton's going to be about 9% of your cap space. Playing the Jets. It's not a good matchup, but if you look at it, he's actually Mitch Trubinsky's favorite target there, so he's having a very good year. So those are tight ends I think you should consider.
All right, I completely agree. I like those picks. I didn't mention Trey Burton, but I agree. I like that. He's solid. When you know tight end is quarterback favorite target, it's hard to argue with those numbers. That's for sure.
Yeah.
All right, so now we come to defenses. I only really have 2 defenses that I want to mention. I know Rob will have some, but we can talk about more defenses in the comments below if you want to. The first one I want to talk about is Kansas City. They're going to cost you 6.5% of your salary. Typically, of course, it varies depending on what daily fantasy you're in. But over the last 5 games, they have 17 sacks. They're getting after the quarterback, forcing turnovers. Kansas City is averaging 37 points a game. That means they're going against teams, they're scoring, and they're forcing them to be one-dimensional to throw the ball. That bodes super well for Kansas City's fantasy defense capability, what they can do. And they've been super hot. They struggled the first couple of weeks, which means that I think a lot of people are looking at them like they're not a good defense. Well, the last 3 games, they've been hot. The last 3 games, they've had 9 sacks, 7 turnovers, and 2 defensive touchdowns. So I really like Kansas City this week against Denver, and a quarterback there, Case Keenum, who is a bit of a gunslinger. He's not a terrible quarterback, but he does have the propensity to turn the ball over a little bit, and so they could certainly capitalize on that.
Talk about gunslingers, it reminds me a lot of Brett Favre. Great quarterback, obviously loved the guy, had great numbers. Yes, also threw a lot of interceptions in his career because he wasn't afraid to take some risks.
Absolutely. And then the other one that I want to talk about is San Francisco. Now they're going to cost you 5.5% of your salary, and I like them for 2 reasons. One, they play Arizona, who gives up the 2nd most fantasy points to defenses, so I absolutely like that. That's huge. Sometimes you just go based on matchup, but on top of that, we've already seen San Francisco play Arizona, and you kind of know what you're going to get with them. And what do you get from the starting quarterback, Josh Rosen, the last time they played? Only a 40% completion percentage for 170 yards and a touchdown. So I absolutely like San Francisco. On top of that, Josh Rosen, it wasn't just one bad game the last time they played. His whole season this year has been weak, where he's averaging less than a touchdown a game. He has yet to throw for more than 1 touchdown. He just simply isn't playing great, and that offense is struggling. You can even see it in David Johnson's, 3.2 yards per carry. So I think San Francisco could seriously capitalize off of a very easy matchup this week, and I like them as well for very cheap.
All right, so for me, when it comes to daily fantasy, I don't like to spend a lot of money on my defenses. Now, I have made exceptions, but it's rare. So going right into it, for me, it's all about saving money. This is where I like to go to near the very bottom. And for me, San Francisco and Arizona, 5% of your salary there. I think that's key. I don't like San Francisco's defense, but Josh Rosen, like you said, is struggling in that offensive line. Going into this year was considered in the bottom 5 in the NFL. They lost their starting center. Pugh is banged up. They're having a lot of issues there in the offensive line, so that could be a cheap play. Also, Kansas City and Denver, I agree with you. I like that one. They're playing in Kansas City, so I like that a lot. And that defense is showing improvement versus a guy, Case Keenum, that will have to throw a lot to play catch up. And whenever a quarterback has to throw a lot, create sacks, interceptions, strip sacks, things like that. So I enjoy that. Another one is Indianapolis versus Oakland. About 7% of your cap space there. The Raiders are allowing the 2nd most points to defenses. Now, the downside of that, it's in Oakland. I wish it was in Indianapolis, but that's still one that could be a nice play. You saw Indy last week had a huge game against Buffalo. Then you got Pittsburgh versus Cleveland there in Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh's not a good defense, but they do get to the quarterback. They've been getting sacks. Last year they led the NFL in sacks. And then the final one, and to me this is the one that I like the most, is New England versus Buffalo, about 7% of your cap space. The Bills allow the most points to defenses out there. So there's some defenses to consider. You want to move on to our recap of last week, or anything you want to add to this before I go?
No, absolutely. There are just a couple of names for defenses right there. Again, if you want to go cheap, if you want to pay for a lot, there are of course some other solid defenses out there. But let's go on, Rob. Recap last week, because you did the video, I didn't do the video, so you can give us a little bit of an idea.
Okay. So here's where we take and recap how we did last week, okay? Well, last week I played a number of different leagues. I invested $22 and won 41. Now, I've told you many times in the videos before, I'm just not a big spender. I have some personal convictions. I'm not telling you how to spend your money, but for me, I typically don't. So I invested 22 and won 41. Now, I made 24 predictions. I talked about 24 different players last week. 4 of them were what I would call neutral plays, players that weren't good or bad, but they were sufficient. 2 that I was off on, and then 18 that I nailed. So I look back last week at about a 90% success rate. Now, if you're tracking for the year, that puts me at about 85% success rate, which I think is really good, because it's not just a matter of saying, hey, start Todd Gurley, start Antonio Brown. It's also taking into account players that you should start that will produce, that are also cheap. So that extra added element, I think, makes it more difficult. I think 85% success rate is pretty good. So week 3, in this one, we shared with you in the video, I invested 8, 129. Week 4, I invested 12, 10. Week after, I invested 7, I won 10. Week after that, I invested 7, 111. And last week, I invested 22 and 141. So on the year, that's $56 invested. I won 91. I'm getting closer to doubling my money. And so that's kind of where I'm at. Talked about Mitch Trubisky. Oh, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to stop and say doubling your money sounds only okay, but when you really estimate it, if you finish in the top half the time, if half the time you're right, you actually only break even, which means that you have to be right basically 75% of the time. And then on top of that, the daily fantasy sites take a portion of that money, so you have to really be in the top. You have to be right basically 80% of the time, so 85% of the time, like you were saying. It's important to remember that just being right a little bit over half the time doesn't actually earn you really any money that's worth doing.
Yeah, and if you're willing to spend more money, you make more money, but I'm just not going to do that. Call me cheap, whatever, but that's just where I'm at. So last week I talked about Mitch Trubisky and Winston and Baker Mayfield, and they all produced. That was good. We talked about Philip Lindsay, Yeldon, Sony Michel, Kenyon Drake, Corey Clement, Tariq Cohen, Tevin Coleman, Peyton Barber. Now, the Peyton Barber one, we told you last week that he was cheap, but we also said he carries risk. And so we kind of preference that. I think we nailed all those picks. Now, the one thing that we couldn't control, a lot of people stayed away from Sony Michel, unfortunately left with an injury, but before the injury, he was actually running well. All the other guys were pretty productive except for Corey Clement. As far as wide receivers go, Jarvis Landry, Michael Crabtree, John Brown, Brandon Cooks, T.Y. Hilton, Sterling Shepard, Josh Gordon, and Taylor Gabriel, the guys that we highlighted there, and they all did well except for Gabriel. That one was off. And then we said CJ Uzuma, OJ Howard, and David Njoku, and they were productive. And then we talked about the Chargers versus Titans and starting the Broncos defense. And so that was kind of a recap of what we did. Now you're going to get into what went behind the lineup that we chose there.
Yeah, exactly. We thought it'd be fun to show you guys the lineup that we put together. So you and me and Matt came together. We put together the lineup. It took us about a half an hour with a little bit of distractions, things happening now, so we're kind of crazy. But the process we went through, first the thing we asked ourselves is kind of, do we want to do tons of cheap guys with few expensive guys, or do we want to do a bunch of guys in the middle? And well, we were like, okay, what we want to do is we just want to pick the cheapest guys and then roll from there and see what happens, and then whichever way we kind of land on those two strategies is fine. We ended up going a lot of guys in the middle for price, and so that's how this lineup ended up being. We started off saying we're not spending money on defense, so we went to go find a good deal. We ended up choosing New England. We either were going to go with Kansas City or New England. We went New England. We liked their matchup against Buffalo, and of course they played well last week. They're very disciplined. And so then we said, okay, what do we want to do next? We looked at quarterback. We bounced around. Eventually we came back to looking at quarterbacks, and we went with Jameis Winston. Unfortunately, with the way daily fantasy works, they don't let you save a lot of money at quarterback. Like if you want to go extremely cheap on quarterback, you're going to have to pick a backup. And so We ended up spending a little bit of money on quarterback, not a lot, but we got Jameis Winston. He has a high ceiling, and we really like him. The other quarterback we talked about maybe going with was Kirk Cousins, but we ended up going with Winston. We like him more this week.
Yeah, when we looked at quarterbacks, so the idea was we want to go as cheap as possible, but still have guaranteed production. There's other guys that were cheaper out there. You could go with Beathard, you could go with Rose and things like that, but they're risky. So this was the cheapest guy that we felt had guaranteed solid production. That was kind of our mindset there.
And then we went with James Conner at running back. Now he cost $30. That's actually pretty cheap. A lot of the running backs around him, now that's not necessarily saving money, but it wasn't necessarily spending a lot of money either. When you look at a lot of the guys around him, were more expensive but far less safe options, made us a little bit uncomfortable. And so 30 for a guy who over the last 2 games has had over 200 yards and 4 touchdowns, who's been extremely productive with a good matchup. I mean, there's almost no arguing that right there. Seemed like an obvious pick to us. Then we went James White. This is a half PPR league, and that's something that motivated us to pick him. I mean, the guy's got 6 receiving touchdowns this year, 7 total. Sony Michel is not playing. This could be an absolutely huge week for James White against the Buffalo Bills, who Patriots will probably get up early and be running the ball a lot. That could mean James White could seriously see a lot of touches, and so we liked him. He also only cost us, 10.5% of our salary, or $21 according to Yahoo, which is what we were doing, and so that was also fairly cheap as well, and so we liked that pick. That was one that we came to. We were waffling between him and between Lamar Miller, and we went with him. Of course, Miller had a good day. We'll end up seeing what James White ends up doing. And then this was, again, you and Matt had talked about this, and you guys had a bit more hand in deciding on Mike Evans. So why did we go with Mike Evans?
Yeah, I've won in daily fantasy with a lot of different strategies. I've had where I go really expensive and really cheap, or somewhere in the middle. And this one, we kind of went in the middle in terms of our salaries and what we spent. We felt that was our best and safest production. So I look at Mike Evans. So he has a good matchup, and he's a tier 1 wide receiver, that sort of talent. He's had 3 games with over 100 yards, and he's got 3 touchdowns on the year. This guy is very talented. He's got the talent of a player like, for example, Hopkins or Brown, but he didn't cost us that much. And so he was kind of on that next level as far as cost goes, with the ability to have what I would call tier 1 wide receiver 1 production there. And so we just felt like he was a safe play there, the guy that we could trust with the money that we had. And we had a little extra spending at the end there with our wide receivers.
Yeah, exactly. What we did is we made our lineup, and then we were able to look at it and say we've got a little money left over. If we shift this player, switch him with him, we can adjust. And right. So once you make your lineup and you have it and you're looking at it, feel free to move it around from there. You don't have to be set, right? And then, of course, we went with our final 2 wideouts there. Jarvis Landry and Emmanuel Sanders. We've already talked about why we think they're good this week, but we just ended up saying, hey, we've got a pretty good amount of money. We can afford to get 2 medium receivers as far as their cost goes, and so we went with those guys. We think they're great picks this week. I don't know much more of a way to explain that, really.
Yeah, when we looked at our wide receivers, we started the cheapest one just to make sure we're not missing any bargain bin wide receivers out there that are a great play, and that can happen. Never assume. So always start at the bottom and worked our way up, and when we got to Jarvis Landry, I think of all the wide receivers, he's the one that immediately all 3 of us said, okay, boom, we're going to put him in. He's still pretty cheap. He's got a great matchup, and he was the one I think that we were all across the board agreed on that one with pretty quickly.
Absolutely, yeah. And of course we went tight end David Njoku, and that was the thing where we had a worse tight end, a cheaper tight end, and we saved some money again because of the way we put together our lineup. We were able to upgrade to him. We feel like he's a safe option who has a good matchup. That's kind of the way we put together. It was simply knowing the players and knowing the prices and just trying to get the best value for each guy and being flexible to throw names around and put guy in the lineup and then take him out and then put him back in. And we looked at all these different options. And then finally, I guess the biggest thing of advice going forward this week and every week is what we do. We pull up a position, we want to look at quarterbacks, we just scroll straight to the bottom. We want to look at the cheapest guys, and we're just going to keep going up and up and up until we finally find a guy that we feel like is going to get us production, and then we say, there's the price tag. Boom, we throw them in the lineup, and then we kind of see what we're working with. And then by the end, we've put together a lineup of very cheap guys, and we've got money left over, and we start swapping guys out for more expensive, better options.
Yeah, and then we always reevaluate come Saturday or Sunday morning, evening. But you forgot about talking about one guy that right now I actually feel really good about our choice there.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, why don't you talk about him? Kenyon Drake, we're happy we picked him. He had 2 touchdowns the other day.
Yeah, Kenyon Drake is a guy that we think is really cheap. He's been playing very well. He looks explosive. This guy is playing really good. He needs to get more touches in that offense there. Went back and forth between him and Lamar Miller. As it turns out, we should have started both of them. But ultimately, we went with Kenyon Drake, which is good. He had a very good Thursday night game there, better than Lamar Miller. And so we've only had one player gone yet he did well. You can't win your daily fantasy the first game or off of one player, but you can certainly lose it. And so it's better that he went out and had a good production rather than laying an egg and ended up with a couple points. So we feel very good about that last-second decision to put Kenyon Drake in there. So
absolutely. So there's our lineup for this week. There's our advice, and there's our recap. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. As always, feel free to leave a comment, like, share, subscribe, do whatever you want to do to help us. Just again, be involved in our community. We guys, thank you so much for watching. You have a great day, and God bless.